Hello everyone, I'm Jeanie Dean, and tonight's talk is on sound, acoustics, and resonance. And I'm very delighted to be giving this and that we're going to be able to share this information. Being a dancer, sound and music have always been very important to me. And having clairaudience, I also have a unique connection to sound. This talk comes out of the work we've been doing with sacred geometry, and it also comes out of looking at ancient sites. The last research I did was on places on the planet that are kind of inexplicable, and many of them have unique sound qualities, and that kind of led to asking more about that. So our general topics are going to be acoustics in ancient culture, Pythagoras and sacred geometry, the whole new world of cymatics, including the CIA connection, and new research, and then developments in sound healing. And this is Tehuanaco, Peru, which is a site that is known to be connected with other sites that have some unique sound properties. So acoustics in ancient architecture. I'm kind of going to go through these quickly because, as usual, I'm thorough to the point of overload. But this is the hypogeum in Malta, which has a speaking chamber, which is a hole in the wall carved with like beveled edges or beveled interior, and it produces an echo that reverberates throughout the hypogeum and other chambers. And so it's believed it was used for different ceremonies and rituals and inductions and transmissions. It also generates a rhythm like the heartbeat. The hypogeum is an amazing space, and we looked at that already. The resonance is at the 70 to 114 hertz. Well, this is in another site in Malta, and that frequency comes up in many of the sites that they've discovered worldwide. In another site is in Tibet, where it's been observed stones being lifted by monks chanting, and that's from an eyewitness account. And of course, if you've seen pictures of these incredible crevice, mountainous areas with carvings placed, and you can't even conceive of how they were placed there. So the next sites are Latin America. This is, first of all, Tehuanaco in Peru is known for its unusual stones and also its unusual sound properties. In another site in Peru, Chaven de Honter has a honeycomb platform that extends for an extremely long distance that carries sound through echo chambers. It's quite a long distance in a matter of meters. Uxmal is a site in Mexico for the Mayans, and that also has unusual sound capabilities, where it's been speculated and lore says that the site was built by short people who whistled and moved heavy rocks into place. Another site is the ball court of Chichen Itza, which is depicted on the bottom. And so it's this long, narrow stretch, and there are a couple places where you can stand and say, something as silent as a whisper, and it can be heard 500 feet away in another part of the ball court. So they don't know if this was like used for coaches to tell the players what to do, or what purpose that had. We don't know much about the ball game of the Mayan, so it's hard to speculate.
Is that the one they don't use hands or feet?
Well, right, and there's this narrow ring that's up high, and they have to
get the ball in the hole.
Yeah, they have to get it to go through.
But they can't use their hands? Is it that?
I can't vouch for that.
Oh,
okay. And this last site is Chichen Itza, and it's known that shouts and other kinds of noises will echo as a shriek that literally comes out from the structure. And Chichen Itza, of course, is known for its presentation at the equinox. Another type of ancient figure is lithophones. And these are like the painted caves in France and Spain. There's thousands of them. And many of them are musical. Some of it is natural stalagmites and stalactites. But other are stones that are shaped and positioned, but they're known to issue a pure bells or gong-like notes. And many of these sites have geometric patterns and animal figures. And some of the sites, the sounds would emanate what the animals that are depicted. It's now the archaeologists are starting to speculate that they pick sites because of their sound quality. Here's another set of sites. These are called ringing rocks. And in Lake Onega in Russia, they found these rocks and they're very musical stone drums. And in Brooks County, Pennsylvania, there's a very famous site where people go and climb and walk. And then there's the Round Rocks in Utah, which we see here, and so these are also very resonant. There's also in South Africa a series of sites that are called stone circles, and this is being researched by Michael Tellinger, and there's thousands and hundreds of these stone circles throughout South Africa, and they've been just ignored for abandoned ruins, but there's scientists are starting to really take a closer look and seeing there's some kind of connection with them. In a way, they're like the effigy mounds of North America, and like in Wisconsin, we have 10,000 effigy mounds, or we did, that were cataloged, and the group seems to be part of a very large formation that was used by a continuous group of people. And it may be the same with these sites. Many of the sites, they're finding these cone-shaped stones that are resonant, and they ring like a bell. And other people report unusual energy and even feeling healing from being at these sites. So something's going on there. This is a quote from National Geographic about cave drawing site that was resonant, and the researcher said prehistoric peoples chose places of natural resonant sound to draw their famed cave sketches according to a new analysis of caves in France. In at least 10 locations, drawings of horses, bison, and mammoth seem to match locations that focus, amplify, and transform the sound of the human voices and musical instruments. An intriguing suggestion is that the acoustic properties of the cave influenced what animals were painted on the walls. So we think it's the other way around, but now they're starting to say, what if that was one of their main points? It's quite remarkable. I've heard recordings of it, and many of these sites, they don't even let people go in, so those recordings are kind of precious. And it will sound like a herd of mammoth or a herd of bison running through this enclosed space. So this is more about some of this research. Igor Reznov and Michael Dove studied caves in the French Pyrenees and also found a connection that they concluded that music or chants were important in cave ceremonies. And continuing with stone circles, there's quite a few sites like Stonehenge that have been found throughout England, kind of like what we've been finding with the African sites, and that they're surmising that the stones may have been positioned to serve an audio function, that they were like speakers or reflectors and transmitters. Another site that occurs in England and the British Isles is burial mounds, also called cairns. And these typically have long, narrow chambers and that are tunnel-like, And they're finding that these sites also have high resonant qualities, that they could amplify drum beat and, you know, lead to trance states perhaps, or some other purpose. This one scholar, David Keating, in his research proposes that they're generating a Helmholtz resonance, which is like when you blow on a bottle and it's really a deep noise, and it can kind of penetrate your bones with its low frequency. They also observe that with these dark tunnels, the sound is even more enhanced, which is true. So these are just a variety of sites that show that in antiquity there was some knowledge and use of sound. The Stonehenge is famous for the blue stones, and that's the inner circle. There's two main circles at Stonehenge, and they've been called the lords of prehistoric Europe because people would go there and get healed by experiencing, touching, and being in the field of these blue stones. They're actually dolerite, a kind of quartz, and they're brought from the Presley mines, which is some distance away. So they're known for their sound qualities. And then this 110 hertz, again, was mentioned at some of the sites in Latin America, and for the sites in England, a similar number. This picture is Newgrange, and that's the beginning of that long tunnel that's at Newgrange. So you can see it's kind of a resonant chamber. And people are starting to make inquiries about the Great Pyramid, and the Great Pyramid is a beveled grand gallery, which beveled means it goes like this, you know, it narrows. And when people see that who are in the music biz, they see speakers, you know, they see sound chambers. This one is also very fascinating. It's the theater at Epidaurus. And there are other theaters throughout the Greek and Roman world that have similar capabilities. And the idea is that the person standing at the center can be heard in the top row. And it has to do with the angle of the rise. There's been quite a bit of naysayers who've challenged this, but people who've traveled there experience it, and, you know, I mean, we could still witness it. But this ability for this space to allow thousands of people to attend a theater event and hear it all is based on pure mechanics of sound. So this one study by the George Institute of Technology, they found that the limestone seats provided a filter, and they proposed that suppressed some of the ambient noise and helped make the speakers' voices more clear. They also proposed that the fact that this is a corrugated surface also gives it additional resonant capability. And finally, they think it's a frequency of about 500 hertz. Everybody watches Rick Steves on public television and his tours of Europe, the traveling show, and he's gone to one of these, and they did a test, and you could hear his voice up at the top. His cameraman was at the top, and he was in the bottom. So there's an example. I think there's a lot to be learned from those sites. Vitruvius, the Roman architect, from which we get the Vitruvius Man from Leonardo da Vinci, the five-figured man. He studied Vitruvius, and Vitruvius wrote several chapters on the architecture of theaters. and the design of theaters. And it has a lot to do with geometry. And this is a space that's very interesting. This is in India, and it's called the Vitala Temple, and it's in the county or area of Hampi. And each of these pillars is remarkable in that they are playing different tones. And they usually strike them with sandalwood.
They look like they're different lengths.
Yeah.
The colors.
So they've been able to use them in a rhythmic manner with sandalwood. Geological analysis reveals that, what does it say at the bottom? The rocks are resident due to metallic or in large amounts of silica. But it is mind-boggling why the different pillars bring different notes. This is a piece in the British Museum. It's called the Shabako Stone, and it's a significant text after the Rosetta, and it depicts the god Ptah, who was called the cosmic architect, creating the cosmos, and these are the words that he uttered. And it says, "Lo, every word of God came into being through the thoughts of the mind and the command on the tongue." And so this is very reminiscent of, you know, the opening words of the Bible, except, well, God said, "Let there be light." And so the creation begins with God speaking the words. This is a site in Greece, the home place of Jupiter, and it's also known for its unique acoustic properties, where places along the hills around it have curious echoes and resonance as well. So that was just a little tour of ancient sites. Again, no answers, but questions that these sites propose and cause us to wonder. So the next piece is about Pythagoras, and truly Pythagoras is a great teacher of humanity, and we could probably do, you know, a whole year on Pythagoras. He said there is geometry in the humming of the strings, there is music in the spacing of the spheres. And Pythagoras' story, well, this is an interesting figure, and one of the things that new research is showing is that we can image sound, and often the imaging of sound yields these circular figures. This is two renditions of the orbit of Venus. And Venus moves around along with the Earth and is a morning star for 6 weeks, and then it goes into decline where we don't see it, and then it reemerges as an evening star for another 6 weeks. And it does this through the course of the year. And this is the image of the travels of Venus. And Pythagoras was deeply interested in what he called the sound of the spheres and the music of the spheres. So he's called the father of numbers. He was born in Samos in the 6th century BC. He discovered musical harmonies, and the musical octave system that we use today is based on what Pythagoras came up with. And I'm kind of I have other slides about this, but he took a vibrating musical string and found that if you cut it in half, it was vibrating at the octave above it. And they, of course, knew about octaves and things back then. His work with harmonics through 12 scales led to a thing they call the Pythagorean comma, which is where the sound goes flat. where there's this ratios, mathematical ratios of note to note, and after a certain number of permutations, it becomes dissident, and they call it the Pythagorean comma. And it's been a thing that's been a bane of Western music culture for a long time, to try to rearrange the musical octave system to accommodate for this shift. And it's a very interesting statement about a collection of experience within Western culture and our connection to the ancient knowledge. And indeed, if there's anybody who is a transition between the ancient world and our world, it's Pythagoras. Part of his story is that he went to Greece, and he's from Greece, or an island off Greece, and he studied in the Egyptian temples for a good 12 years, then became a prisoner in Babylon for another 12 years, and learned quite a bit of the Babylonian number systems and star keeping systems. Finally comes back to the Mediterranean and brings all this knowledge. And so he is this link between the oldest of antiquity to the Greeks. And Western culture, of course, is based on the great tradition of the Greek masters, and Pythagoras begins that, Plato and Aristotle and Socrates. And of course we know that now the Celts really are a group of Greek migrants from the northern Peloponnese to the Celtic islands, probably because the salt was there, but we're getting off task. Pythagoras was known for his healing abilities. He played music, and he communed with the animals in the forest. He was known to be able to lay down with creatures like bears. And he told priests he could hear the harmony of the spheres. He could literally hear it. He was a contemporary of Buddha and said to be part of the Essenes. He studied not only geometry and math and music, but he studied law and philosophy. And again, his story is so amazing, and we don't have time for it all. But let's take a look at some of the things he left us. He came up with the Tetractys, which is a core idea in both, say, Freemasonry and in sacred geometry, of this triangle where contains all the digits, the 10 digits, and they all add up to each other. Another gift that we all learn in 3rd grade or something is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. Mm-hmm. So here's the right triangle right there in the red. And he also gave us the music scale. So based on his understanding of ratios. Another thing that we have from Pythagoras, and probably others of this era, is the idea of the 7 modes. And we're studying sacred geometry, and we were looking at chapter 7 last week, and we looked a little bit at the 7 modes. And the 7 modes are more than just musical octaves. It's a whole system, including a state like gas, liquid, water. It's a vowel, it's a deity, it's a color, it's a scent, it's a taste, it's a kind of architecture. So like we start with Ionian, in Dorian, we know about those architectural forms. The other ones are Phrygian, the Lydian, the Mixolydian, the Aeolian, and the Locrian. There's a mnemonic to remember it, and it's I do follow lonely men and laugh. So those are the 7 modes. And in trying to learn more about them, there's not much out there. You really have to start scouring text in classic libraries to get it. It's becoming lost. It's becoming forgotten. But when we look at the modes, the Ionian is the most popular, and that would be even like Hey Jude is written in Ionian. Dorian is considered more like the Celtic songs that have a plaintive quality and unfinished, longing. And the Phrygian are more upbeat and good for solos. The Lydian are considered jazz-like. The Mixolydian are considered changeable and even bombastic or warring. And the Aeolian are the sad. And the last one, the Locrian, is considered to be dissonant and hard to make music from. All of these are based on the major C scale, and then each one of these are considered like their own octave or their own tone, and then they're, so in the major C scale, C is the beginning note, and then progressing through each of these, the beginning note is D, E, F, G, A, and B. And high C is kind of considered the standard for a lot of octaves and the relevant for music theory. In terms of tuning, there's a story of Pythagoras that he observed the sound of the blacksmith's anvil seemed to change depending on the different hammers they used. So he heard this difference, and he began inquiring about the length of a string, and found that if the string was cut in half, then the sound was the same octave. And then in further permutations of changing the size of the spring, he found the fifth and the fourth, and then these are now accepted as substantial chord changes. The original lyre that he used, was a 7-string, and he added an 8th string, and he felt that the 8th string was important because it introduced the next octave. So there's 7 notes in an octave, and that even the word harmony actually means octave. And so when we think about harmony, and this is a whole idea system that, again, is probably deeply lost to us, but these are some images of keyboard and systems of noting chords and the octaves. There's a thing called the circle of fifths, and that's represented over here. And we start with the C major. And I'm not versed in music theory, so I'm saving that for my another time. This figure here is called the Web of Athena, and it's 3 7-pointed figures arranged on top of each other, and this was considered a very significant mystical key in the ancient world, and it does relate to music. So we'll leave it at that. This is more on the circle of fifths, and about this problem that because he was using the idea of ratios to separate the musical tones, that when it allows the dissonance to creep in, and that difference is called the Pythagorean comma. And it's a big part of Western culture and music theory to get away from that. This also plays into another controversy in music and sound, which is what frequency the key of A is tuned at, which is used for all major orchestra tunings and piano tunings. So I will leave that with you because we don't have time to get into the depths of it. But again, this is a rendition of a series of notes in one of the scales. In terms of the music of the spheres, he also saw this series of ratios. Here's Earth at the center, and going out to Luna, Mercury, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, that there was this ratio, and we know this to be true, it's part of the Fibonacci series. It corresponds to that there is this idea of resonance based on the ratios of the distance. And this one shows the astrology, and the zodiac is a universal principle that it exists in every country of the world. It's throughout Asia and India as well as the West. So this is a rendering of the idea of the modes and the through what might be considered a snake. So Kepler, who was from the medieval era, took Pythagoras' ideas and wrote the Harmony of the World, the Harmonica Mundi, and he codified quite a lot of the information that was part of the ancient world having to do with harmonics, astrology, music, and the solar system. So it's just something to be aware of. In looking at some of the principles of sonic, well, people are calling it sonic geometry. So quite a few things come through from Pythagoras and the ancients. One of them is the number 432. And it's been considered a number of universal math. I forget the fellow on public television who did that series on mythology in Moyers. Yeah, he called it the most significant number in our universe. And to begin with, they found, researchers are now finding that when ancient instruments are measured, they vibrate at about 432 frequency. So this, even on a physical level, this number is a lodestone. And so Pythagoras found that the fourth octave to be a keystone of tuning, which was A, and what the tuning that was known, that was passed on through word of ear throughout the medieval era, and we do know from the transition into the modern era that this tuning was at about 432 hertz, and that it's consistent with very ancient instruments that we still know of. And also that the geometry of sound is expressed through the F sharp chord, and that's a very popular chord. These are some woodcuts from the medieval era of Pythagoras playing instruments. So here he is with an instrument that he developed called the monochord, which goes beyond the lyre. And here's a bell, here is flutes, and of course the drums or rattles. And this is a picture of coherent forms, just a sort of a palette
So like
cleanser.
sand on a vibrating membrane?
Exactly, and yeah, so this is from cymatics, and quite beautiful, quite interesting. Within Plato and Pythagoras, there is this continuity with 432 and factors of 9. And Plato created a system of notes, and they all were set to numbers that were multiples of 9, as the major geometric forms are.
How did that happen?
No. Restart. How do I get out of here?
Cancel.
Restarting and
Doesn't it say pause? Don't restart.
Restart later. There we go.
Thank you.
So if we take the triangle, 180 degrees, the square and the circle, 360, the pentagon, 540, the hexagon, 720, the heptagon, the seven-sided figure, and the octagon, 1080. Each of these are the values for the notes. So these notes, F sharp, triangles, C sharp, square, F sharp, the octave, and then A sharp for the heptagon, and C sharp for the next octave itself. Rather, not that. But what's really interesting is the heptagon, which is a 7-sided figure, and we looked at the web of Athena, is that this is the major chord. It's the F3 sharp major chord within this octave. And okay, that's all related to multiples of 9. And then these are the two-dimensional forms that Pythagoras worked on in his day. And Plato came along, and Plato advanced our understanding of three-dimensional forms. They're called the Platonic solids. And so the tetrahedron, and I should have had pictures in here, but I don't. So the tetrahedron is built on the triangle, and it's 4 triangles, it's a pyramid, and its volume is 720. And this also corresponds to F sharp in another octave. The cube is 2160 when we sum the sides, and it's C sharp. The octahedron, which relates to the hexagon, is also, again, a coherent number, and it's at F sharp. And so this is just a little foundational information showing this cross-referencing of the numeric values for these Platonic forms and music.
Could you email me a link to that? Or a copy of it?
Sure. There's a wonderful video that people have spoken of called Sonic Geometry, and they go over this very nicely and very quickly. And some of this is from them, but so continuing with 432, the precession of the equinoxes is the number 25,920 years. When we divide that 25,000 year into 12 periods, we find what's called the Great Month, or like, the age. So right now we're transitioning to the age of Aquarius, and each age is about 2160 years. 12 times 2160 equals 25,000. So that's the precessional cycle. We're all aware of that. And some very interesting things happen related to these numbers. So the diameter of the moon is 2160 miles. And then we look at 2160 and factor all the first 10 digits, and we get all these figures. We get the octagon, the hexagon, the pentagon, and we get 432 with 5, which is the keystone, and we get the square and the circle. So these are the volume of those objects. And then if we look at 216, the reduced version of 2160, it's half of 432. So when we encounter the number 216, it's a lunar attribute that's being expressed. And then going on, so we know 432 is our master key. If we double it, we get 864. And the diameter of the sun is 8,640 miles. And there's 40,200 seconds in a 12-hour day or night, which is half, which is our 432 number. And then the speed of light is 186,282 miles per second approximately. So again, we have the same number within a pretty close plus or minus range. So then if we square 432, it equals 186,624, which is a very good average for the speed of light. And it's the one factor that's closest to the speed of light for any number. We saw, like when we were looking at things with sacred geometry, other relationships between time and space in the number systems, and so then now the sonic geometry is showing it crosses over into music and sound. So in a larger scale, the earth cycles and the sonic frequency and timekeeping and measurement and distance are all connected. And that's another reason why we really should be strong about adhering to the the Babylonian system of 360, the dodecahedron, because without that, without the 360-degree numeric system, we can't get these numbers. Like if we try to get the distance of the moon or the distance of the sun in meters, it all falls apart. There's no harmony, there's no connection, there's no cross-reference. It just doesn't exist. And so the measures of our miles and our cubits was based on this understanding of this ratios in between these forms in time and space. So, just like giving up our freedom for more security because it's more convenient, we can go with the decimal because it's more convenient, and we can lose our sovereignty and our knowledge of timekeeping. Oops, somehow I hit the wrong button here.
Yeah.
I guess I shouldn't be too pontifical here. So, hopefully that was all you needed to see about that, but 432 is a very key number. The last screen was about how 432 plays into some of the counting of the yugas in the Hindu system. And I'm trying to see it on here. So like the Kali Yuga is 432,000 years. And this other Yuga, which is the Dwapar, is quite longer, it's 864. So even within the Hindu system, this key keeps coming up. You could say, oh, it's coincidence. And the Masons have kept some of this knowledge, and so people who participated in this tradition know some of this. So some of the things that are summarized from that are 12 squares, 14,440, and we know that as being a cosmic number. Within the Masons factor, they use 9 grid system. They also consider 432 the key, and they also value the number 13. So the Giza pyramid has 144,000 casing stones. The Mayan 340 Baktun, well, the 340 year called the Baktun has 14,400 days in it. So in the Mayan system. And the Baktun is a really fundamental, that's how they kind of, like ages of man in history. There's 4 chosen ones in the Bible. 144,000 divided by 432 equals 333.333. So it's this infinite 3 that we get. And then 13 times 33.33 equals 432. So there's a relationship between 13 and 3 and 432. We also, the square root of 9 equals 3, which is obvious, but so this is a little example of some of the coding of 9 and 432. And this was a little building in that program about Washington, D.C. and how the Masons have codified a whole lot of structures. And this is in Manhattan, actually. It's 432 Park Avenue. And each floor is 864 square feet. It has 16 windows. It has 201, 600 square feet of glass. There's 33.33 feet to the Statue of Liberty, and there's 33 kilometers to the temple. I can't read that, to the House of the Temple. But that's known to, the 432 Park Avenue is known to be a Masonic building in New York. So I started out talking about the fractals of Venus and the patterns of Venus, and this is a chart that was drawn hundreds of years ago and reproduced. So even in antiquity, they had a recognition of this idea of these coherent forms relating to the movement of the planets. And so I'm kind of closing this piece on Pythagoras with that. And we're going to look at cymatics, and cymatics, that's a picture of a piece of glass with sand on it. And so the cymatics is this technology that has quite a long history, and I'm going to overdo it with the history, but when sound is presented to the surface in various ways, it will manifest these forms. And so this is a new idea of how to look at sound and how sound works, and the idea of coherence and frequency. And so cymatics is considered the study of visible sound. It's a subset of a study called modal phenomena. Cymatics was named by Hans Jeanie, a Swiss MD who pioneered this study, was very fascinated with it. And it derives from the Greek word kuma, or kima, billow or wave, meaning movement. And here's a nice picture from, there's a group called, who have developed a very sophisticated piece of machinery to produce cymatic images, and they're called Cymoscope, and that's what it looks like. So this is where things are at. It started out with a piece of glass and some sand, and this is a growing field. And one of the things that looking at this topic is that there is a great wealth of research and information going on that we're not hearing about in the world. You really have to go look for it, and what it's revealing is astonishing, wonderful, amazing, and it's paradigm shifting stuff. It's huge, very beautiful too. So these are some images of various sound things. I think the blue ones at the top are the vowels, and I did save those for later. Cymatics history, they say, begins with the drum, and this drum has some sand on it, so the idea of when we work that surface, it becomes coherent. Da Vinci said, I say that when a table is struck in different places, the dust that is upon it is reduced to various shapes of mounds and hillocks. The dust descends from the hypotenuse of these hillocks and enters beneath their base and raises its, I don't know why we're losing that last word. It's, I can't read it. And Galileo, long rows of fine streaks parallel and equidistant from one another, presumably caused by the brass filings dancing on the surface of the plate and finding safe haven in a series of parallel nodal striations. Very poetical. So he noticed that when he was chiseling. And this is a beautiful cymatic image. I'm not sure of what. And Robert Hooke became very interested in it after reading people like Galileo and Da Vinci, and he was studying optics and mechanics, and he devised a glass, and then he was able to bow a violin on the edge of it to get it to experience sound, and then the sand would form into a coherent pattern. So that was picked up from him by Ernest Chladni in Germany, and he's considered the father of acoustics because he really spent his life on this. And he used a brass plate, and he continued with the idea of using the violin bow. And many of the figures he created were recorded, and people drew them, and so there was a book about it in the late 1700s. So this is an example of a classic pattern. A woman in France picked up on what he was doing, and when these images were circulated around Europe, Napoleon said, I'll give a prize to anyone who can prove why this works, and it was won by Sophie Germain. And she used the idea of wave-like functions as that they're creating the geometric patterns, and that it was an inference that sound waves create areas of vibration and stillness. So that was the general idea. The first recognition that sound was a wave form, even though we couldn't see it. So and she came up with the math to postulate that. And then Michael Faraday, we've all heard about the Faraday chamber. He worked on this for a summer, it seems, and he called them crispations. And he tried the effects of vibration on different materials, water, oil, and grains. And then he presented the phenomena. And it was picked up by another student who worked with it more deeply. But one of his contemporaries was William Strutt, who is considered involved in seismology. And so they started to see how this could affect other areas of study. So a theory of sound is emerging, and the idea of sound waves, and that's where it gets the word modal phenomena. Margaret Watts Hughes then picked up on what Faraday had done, and she created her own instrument. She found a membrane like rubber and strung it across different surfaces and applied different methods to get sound to that membrane. And then it's almost photographic because she put some kind of material on the surface and then it would change, it'd have a chemical change and it would have to be developed. So she added a lot to this study using what Faraday had introduced, and she called them crispations. And like Faraday, there was this interest in the beauty of the forms, and you can see this is very interesting looking, and it like takes you in. It's like, wow, who knew that was there? And she also then wrote and took it a lot further, and this idea of the beauty of it was also important to Margaret Watts Hughes. In the 20th century, it was continued, Chladni's work was continued in England by Desiree Waller, and she's using new materials, carbon dioxide chips, and then Hans Jeanie in Germany, or rather Switzerland, and he came up with the word kymatic, and really took this to another level. So he invented what he called the tonoscope, which was like the idophone. And he used piezo crystals to excite steel plates driven by an electronic oscillator. And so he used new acoustic techniques. It's almost like, like some of the electronic music we know of. And with the piezo wider frequencies, there was more complex patterns that were able to be expressed. So, I mean, he really went with like, let's see what we can produce, and he expanded it and got this array of sounds and different frequencies, and really started giving us these pictures. Now, so here's La Tourwasser. He's a current 20th century photographer with this company called Cinescope, and so these are some of the images. I mean, it's becoming extremely sophisticated. This is an actual drop of water with some sound, and where it's emerging into something. And that's what's really fun, is to see these in motion as they shift as the sound can change, the sand patterns can change. So I'm not going to spend a lot, but so Lauterwasser is important, and this Thomas Mitchell is Scottish, and he's interesting. He's a Knight Templar, and what he did we'll look at. So this is Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, and this is the site that's close to the Knights Templar. And he and his son started to notice, well, everybody wonders, what do these weird carvings on this pillar mean? And he started to propose that they are related to configurations of sound. And I think we almost need to go back, because it's so. He saw these patterns that were carved, and there's little cubes on the pillars, and so each of those cubes has a little item on it, and he saw those as musical notes. So he started interrogating those symbols, and he started to see that they were like cymatic patterns. So this gets kind of crazy. So he says, okay, here's a cymatic pattern. What is that cymatic pattern or frequency or a note of? And he saw that those cymatic patterns that he, in the chapel, where he translated them into musical notes. And of course he was inspired. You know, of course this isn't based on any long tradition of science, but he is crossing over where he's using the cymatic information to interpret those images. So like you see this pattern here, and he's saying, okay, what is that equal to in terms of a frequency, a sound frequency? And then what's this one? So he's basing the idea that they already knew the ideas, the principles of cymatics. They already knew it, and that they encoded it there. And they did do a symphony, and you can hear it. It's out there, and people liked it. So the last one is John Stuart Reed, and there's a plethora of people working with him. But he's with this group. They went to the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, and they took, originally Stephen Halpern, who, if you've ever heard of him in terms of music work, he's excellent. And he went to the Great Pyramid in the 80s. And how they, you know, it was nobody was there in the early 80s. Shirley MacLaine had gone and, you know, made it famous. But he produced a recording in there, and it's outstanding. So they went back, and then they used the tonoscope or the cymoscope to record doing similar kind of sonations in the Great Pyramid, and got some very interesting images. And they said that some of it looked like hieroglyphic writing, in fact. And so John Stuart Reed is busy with the cymatics in the journal and producing new information. So new research, this is going to be real quick, wave sound theory from the 1800s. The dog barks, it goes in our ear. We hear at a certain range, about 770. It's air pressure hitting our receptors. We consider electrical energy different than sound energy, and new research is suggesting that really sound energy precedes electrical energy, that sound leads to magnetic fields, and then magnetic fields lead to electrical energy, and that and we associate electrical energy with light, but that sound is actually sort of more significant than the light. And this was our great hero Tesla and his work with sound, and he of course was very interested in any pattern that related 3, 6, and 9. Tesla was known to walk around a building 3 times before he'd enter it because he was so invested in 3, 6, 9. This is an image of a sound wave that is a torus, and now this word is entering our vocabulary. And toroidal fields, which are like donuts, and you see them in some of the advanced physics. But they're seeing this in sound waves too. This is a sound imprint from the galaxy. And so Pythagoras was right, there is music in it. And Tesla said, I consider anti-gravity as an unknown property of static electricity without which the transport of rocks, oversized rocks, would be unthinkable. Isolated cases of people or matter floating weightlessly have been described in history, but are not widely discussed due to the lack of convincing justification. But one of the things that we're starting to see is that sound is involved in levitation and floating rocks and things. Tesla also said that Earth is a ringing bell, and so this is another example of a toroidal shape. And if you studied advanced Taoism, you know that the body is a toroidal field with our polarities. And some of the research says that it's not even polar. It's just that this is the way the magnetic fields go. And of course, this is our hollow Earth right there. And there are even images of the galaxy being toroidal with a opening down the center. The Tesla experiment we don't have time for, but it's kind of neat. And this is the idea of intersecting toroidal fields and how it gets complicated. And some of this research is leading to what's called scalar energy. And I've got all these words here. not enough time. And scalar energy is definitely, sometimes they call it Tesla-Whalen waves or Maxwellian waves for Maxwell. And that this is a very strong direction where science is going now. And scalar research is kind of upending traditional ideas we've had about electronics, about the electron particle theory, even quantum physics. One of the worst things about scalar technology is that they've come up with the sonic cannon. So here's a soldier checking his variables and getting ready to blast some people with an unpleasant noise. And so sound weapons have been reported in Pittsburgh, and they call them the LRAD, Long Range Acoustic Device. And the military people say that its strong millimeter wave transmitter is used for crowd control or the goodbye effect. So unfortunately, that's part of the story, is that we can, these things, this knowledge can be weaponized. And returning to this inquiry into toroidal forms, here's some examples on a cosmic blue level and a pure form. One book that might be of interest to everybody is called Punk Science, and it's talking about these things, scalar science and new research involving sound. And the author says, all manifestation is a torus shape, including sound itself, and that this idea of the toroidal field is really where science is headed. And she said time doesn't exist and the future has already happened. I disagree with that. I still think time is sequential. But one of the ideas that's emerging is sound creates magnetic fields, and then the magnetic field creates electricity. And it's usually seen the other way around in electron particle physics. Some of the other discoveries, this is a little thing about sound creating light, and it's called sonoluminescence. And we see it in small creatures in the ocean. And it, like in terms of application, we could use it in a computer to make a switch turn on. But it occurs when a gas bubble is acoustically suspended and then it pops and emits light. So sound can emit light. This is a beautiful image of some advanced musicians who are generating incredible images through mapped light. So they play the instrument and then they have something like a cinescope generating three-dimensional imagery. This is a multi-wave oscillator, which was from a design by Tesla, and Lakhovsky came up with it. And it kills pathogens and bacteria. It's a good thing. We don't know much about where it's going, but that was from the early 20th century. This is Royal Rife. Maybe you've heard of him. And he looks like such a happy northern sweet guy. But he came up with the Rife machine and encoded thousands of frequencies in his system that can target specific pathogens and illnesses. And I would trust him. He was hounded by the United States government and sort of shut down. And there are various companies who tried to revive his patents, and maybe with varying success. This is a new person, Anthony Holland, giving a TED talk, and he's showing a cancer cell being split with using sound energy. And so this stuff is happening, we're just not hearing about it. Here's some examples of levitation with sound. So this is David Deek, who's using pressure waves. You can see the little balls are suspended between these two sound speakers. And there's the idea of it. You have two waves that interfere with each other, but there's a point where it becomes flat and it holds the item there. And I guess I wish we had more time. So this is an image of another example of levitation. And this is the most interesting one of all to me. This is Viktor Grebennikov from the 1950s. And there he is on a little platform he created that allowed him to levitate. And you can see here he's on the ground. So there he's on the ground and here he's levitated. And what he did was he studied wings of bugs, and the wings of the bugs were way too small to support the bug's ability to fly. And he determined that of course we've seen wings and they all have vessels and things in them, that those vessels were actually for sound resonance. And it wasn't that they were carrying fluid, but that they were carrying sound, they were resonating sound, and that sound energy amplified the ability or the capacity of the wing to lift the bug. And so then he used sound research and came up with this levitation platform. And so this is a very significant piece of work showing how sound can lift things that are much higher than we expect. This is Coral Castle in the wonderful Florida, built in the 1950s by another very jolly Swedish fellow or something. And he has this weird little machine here. I probably could have had a better picture. His name is Edward Leekskallen, and was built in the 1920s. And they believe, people saw him holding cones and then the rocks. And he would often do his building at night because he didn't want to be seen. And his site is really beautiful, and it baffles people how he did it. But he had studied sort of esoteric work and came up with an approach to levitation. This is John Ernst Worrell in the 1880s, and this is his machine. And he also was able to lift and get objects to fly, and it's considered levitation. And he used gyroscopes. Very jocular looking fellow. And in Israel, Tel Aviv, this is an image of what's called quantum locking, and it involves sound fields. And so you have a little cube being levitated. And then this is an example of actual mass transit vehicle being slightly levitated over through a pulsed field. There's new work on 3 kinds of magnetism: ferromagnetism, which we know about with iron magnets, and para, involving fluids, oxygen, salt, and other wet stuff, and piezo magnetism, where items repel. And so they're looking at that in semiconductor research. Here's Peter Davy in New Zealand, who was able to boil water. You can see there he is with his device, and he died not giving the world his technology. And this was a recent thing done by some students at George Mason University, where they have a sound device that can extinguish fires. And again, will the world let them produce their invention? Because we're invested in doing things the way we've always done them. And this is a patent for a tornado producing device and a hurricane producing device that's sound based. And this text is the description. A method is disclosed for affecting the direction of low atmospheric weather system. Audio generators are positioned to project sound waves toward a peripheral area of a weather system. So that was in 2001. This is an example of DNA being induced through sound waves, and that was a recent study. This is sound in space with NASA, and some of the recordings. We have machinery that is producing images from space of sound, and it's quite remarkable. There's recordings by the Cassini spacecraft of Saturn, and the raw audio is at the University of Iowa, and I've heard, and it's kind of interesting. So all of this is just background. And when I approached this topic, I was just astounded by how much is happening, and again, I'm just kind of giving a big sampler plate of it and opening our eyes to new possibilities. Crop circles something we all know and love, and this is a very beautiful, complicated one. And some of this idea comes from De Silva. I can't remember his first name. He's real active in ancient sites and new stuff. And he's postulated that the crop circles are being laid down by sound. And part of the reason is no physical damage is found on any of the plants. Nothing in the area has changed. And when they started considering sound, some of the crop circles started putting images that related to sound, which is kind of cool. And this is an image over here of Pythagoras' musical spheres in three-dimensional form. So the crop circle hum is something that's been reported by many witnesses. And so through a collection of different sources, they're arriving at what it said here, that people who've been present when the crop circles emerged would hear a banging together of weed heads despite an absence of wind. Damn it, I said that. So let me go back. So they would experience a silence, and then a trilling noise, and then a banging together of weed heads, and then the crops would just lie down in a spiral fashion, and this would all occur in less than 15 seconds. And Colin Andrews is somebody who's been really involved with crop circles for a long time. He's heard this trilling noise and been able to record it. And other studies of music and sound have found very significant effects on plants. But what's most interesting is the plants are changed, but they're not destroyed. And that they bend over at a 90-degree angle. And it's all very coherent, and these are just a small number of examples. So the best theory that anyone's come up with is that these crop circles are produced through sound. Another new research is showing that sound can travel faster than light, and this was just in 2007. And it was sound that was broken up into multiple waves, so it's the pulse that moves faster than light. So it's not like the actual sound. But one thing about sound and velocity is that sound travels better through solid systems than it does air. Oh, and people who are make speakers and things know this. Looks like we're pretty much getting close to being done here. Another research is on getting electrons to spin, which is also showing that sound is able to overseed what we know about electron theory. And here's a nice statement from Einstein. Concerning matter, we've been all wrong. What we have called matter is energy whose vibration has been so lowered as to be perceptible to the senses. And this is an image of plasma waves coming in from the sky. And so he says, all matter vibrates at specific rates and everything has its own melody. So there's this idea that everything is vibrating and making some kind of sound. And one of the things that my research shows me is that there's a lot of information that's not being dispersed to the public. I mean, we see it everywhere. I mean, there's lack of information. There was a big storm this summer in the state of Wisconsin that caused hundreds and hundreds of trees in a national forest to be uprooted, and there's hardly any word of it. It's just an example of the news not getting said. But what is being discovered is starting to challenge the electromagnetic theory and the particle theory, and that there's a growing interest in torus fields, both mathematically, geometrically, and physically. It's now believed that the energy sequences sound and motion resonate, produce magnetic fields, and that they then generate electronics. So electronics is sort of the bottom of the hill of energy flow. And So we have a few minutes for healing. A lot of work's been done on sound in the heart, and we know the heart is beating and making a sound, ba-dub-dub, ba-dub, you know, and that it affects most of our major endocrine glands. This is a beautiful image of a heart mandala that was produced by a singer, Japanese singer Izumi, and it was done at Cinescope. This is more about drumming and how that in particular is very positive for the heart. And we've all seen drum circles and the benefits of that. Sound can also energize air and oxygen. And they're now, research is proposing that when we breathe, we're actually making noise, and you can hear it if you cup your hand to your ear. But that sound is energizing the oxygen that we take in. And then we release the air, and it's then energized. Here's an image of the oldest of the old, the Sumerians, with their, notice the pineal gland, pine cone, and the watch. And this is a classic image of the Eye of Horus, showing the factors for the Fibonacci series. This is Michael Tellinger, who's been working with these sites in South Africa with some stones that they found that are resonant and ringing, and also they keep finding these toroidal stones around sites. Often they're overlooked, and he's starting to make people pay attention to them and say, there's something going on here. And there's more to that story. He makes the connection that if you look at those stones, he calls it rods and cones, and that's the eye is a series of rods and cones. The eye itself is a toroidal structure, and then we have these cones in the back where light is then established in the brain for reception. And there's just a very beautiful cinescope image that's kind of toroidal. The connection between sound and language and creation has not been unnoticed. These are images of all the vowels, A, E, I, O, and U. And if we had, I think they're very interesting. I want to study them. If you look at E, it's got this pentagon to it, and A is like an eye, and they're different. They have, a symbol of something. And again, the idea of the creation of the universe is based on song, and many of the traditions talk about that. Traditionally, we've seen sound as this kind of wave imprint, a two-dimensional flat thing, and now we're seeing it as this standing wave, this two-dimensional and possibly three-dimensional field. And this is kind of returning to Pythagoras, who said the goal in all healing, medical, spiritual, and transformational is to raise the frequency. And again, a recognition of the significance of drumming. And usually it's found that a steady rate of 4.5 beats per second induces a trance-like state. And if it's sustained for 15 minutes, we can go into the zone. Water is also being resonated with sound, and there's interesting research. This one here is an image of water at 432 hertz, that key number. And then this is 440 hertz, which is what we tune A to now, 440, and this 432 is the traditional. And there's much more information, much more coherence in the 432. Perhaps some of you have heard of the solfeggio scale, and it's becoming very well recognized as having healing qualities. And this goes back to the Gregorian chants, which actually goes back to some of the ideas from Pythagoras. It went through a period where it was sort of lost to the world, and then it was rediscovered in the 1970s. And it's based on a scale that's not do, re, mi, but ut, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. And then each of those notes has a frequency, and it's associated with different kinds of energy. So the ut is liberating guilt, 417 is change, 528 is transformation, mi is miracles, 639 is relationships, 741 is intuition, and 852 is spiritual order. And again, this is based on 369, another nod to Tesla and to Pythagoras. And we don't have time to look at the whole history of that, but it's kind of interesting. This is again this is that web of Athena, the 7-star overlap. So these are the frequencies, and that web of Venus is a figure that is very ancient and considered very significant as encoding sacred knowledge. If we had time, we could click this link, but we're kind of tight. Another type is binaural beats, and binaural beats where you have a headphone and one beat, one ear is to one frequency and the other is to slightly different, and then the brain entrains to a value in between. So that entrainment is found to be very significant in being able to achieve like alpha, theta, delta states. And so there are different frequency levels, and the gamma is considered the most creative, and that's a technology using sound that's very positive. Another image of sound in water, a little eye palette cleanser. Another technology is tuning forks, and Rita, you know so much about them. You'll have to do a talk here sometime on that. All we can do is just mention it. And I know I've experienced it, and they're very powerful. Here's another image of the scale of fifths with colored imagery aligned to different colors. And there is a big controversy that I mentioned earlier about tuning in modern times. And we tune to the A above middle C, and originally it was about 432, 435, and they call it I can't remember, but it was tuned to a standard that one of the great composers used. And for decades, since the 20th century, it was set at 440 by an international consortium. And people started to say, wait a minute, oh, it's Verdi's A. Because the old school people remembered that older tuning. And there's been a great deal of interest returning to that. And there's a really wonderful YouTube by a fellow named Paul Davids, who goes through the whole history of it. And some people say there's a conspiracy that the Nazis were involved, because if we use the 440 resonance, people are more unstable, they're more anxious, they're more uncomfortable, and they're therefore more easily programmed as a society. And that they wanted to do that, they wanted to agitate the public in terms of their mission for propaganda. So there's that theory. But you can try for yourself. There's plenty of videos that compare 432 versus 440, you know, your favorite instrument, guitar, piano, what have you, and see if you feel or notice that energy change, or which one you prefer. And the last thing I have is a couple images of artists. So this was a painting with paint and speakers that I don't know how this person did it. It looks really interesting. This is Aeolian wind harps, and they're all over the country and all over the world. It's based on an old Greek idea, these gigantic wind harps. And that isn't the best picture, but these are pipe driven. But these are some different sites where there are wind harps, which are kind of fun. And this is James Nair's, and James is in, his exhibit is in our fair town of Milwaukee right now. And this blue image is one brush stroke made with a gigantic brush with his body attached to the brush. And so it was a sweeping of a pendulum, his body drawing this one stroke. So it's interesting, his inquiry into the idea of movement and motion is something to see. Here is a ball, and we know from geometry how hard it is. It's a concrete ball that he created. So he did films of it swinging and the pendulum motion. And then this is a very current piece he did, which is sort of these undulating waves overlapping and intersecting. And this is a sculpture of speakers mounted on, they look like little plants or flowers you might see at a wetland. And
does it play music?
I don't know. I don't think so. But it might. I wondered that too. I couldn't find that out. And this is a neon work based on a cinescope image that Linda Glenhill has done. And here's somebody who I think is doing some very good stuff in sound health. Her name's Sherry Edwards, and her organization's called Bioacoustics. And she has some software. It works on 3 different levels. One just gives you personality traits. Another can analyze your body for frequencies that you don't present when you speak, and they record, and those missing frequencies are seen as vectors for illness. And so then their final software tries to augment, or their programming augments frequencies that you don't have. And there was research done in the 60s that found if you couldn't hear a frequency, you couldn't produce it. You couldn't speak it or say it. And that led to this idea that that is tied to where people have illness. And this is a place called the Marion Matrix. And they're connected to the Simoscope people, but they have some unusual and very expensive products available. But one of the founders, it was said, Lynn Claire's job is as an intelligence agent who carries about the secret formula she has discovered, the logo of relationships. So, and if you see the eye there, people are very interested in this topic, you know. So let's go on then. But there are some incredible providers and researchers in this area of sound, and I leave you with the idea of this toroidal shape, this flow of energy. And just to recap, there's ancient tradition of using sound. Pythagoras gave us a lot of information about it. New research is not presented, although amazing discoveries are occurring. New research is challenging the electromagnetic and particle theory. Understanding of torus fields and magnetics is a challenge for us going forward. And it may even set Newton's ideas of gravity to rest. Energy sequence is seen as sound, motion, and then magnetic field that leads to electronic states. And all matter is making sound. All matter is generating magnetic and resonant fields. And sound can alter, enhance, and heal or harm organic life. This little image of the Sumerians just looks so much like it could be a sound device. There's also the idea of these are the humans and here's the gigantic God. What is that thing there? What is that thing there? What is that?
Stuff.
You know, like that one film company, their logo is, what is that? And here's some good people, the dear Tibetan monks, carrying the longhorns, reminding us, resonating us. So thank you. And thoughts, questions, feedback?
Bravo.
I think a lot of what you talked about we use to heal the body.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just all, you know, you look at Pythagorean's theorem, you look at the sonic geometry, we now have the sonic slider. And so, you know, we're removing the information with that. You're looking at the monochord, which is underneath massage table, and they play the music right underneath there. The torrid fields, which is with the biofield tuning, and she talks about that constantly. And then Eric Erke talks about the scalar energy, and that's, you know, he's got a book out about that, and he's right here from Milwaukee.
Excellent.
And then you talk about, you know, like you talked about the heart, and you can take 2 forks, and I can just point them like that to a certain location, and I can bring somebody's blood pressure down, and I can also shift the AFib. No drugs, no nothing, and it's just like that. And it's, you know, it's the intention of what it is that you're doing. And then you're talking about, you know, like the frequencies, you can add, subtract, you can move, you can use the quantum physics, and that'll completely shift the body. And so that's pretty fun. And then you talked about the water, and that's emodal, and you can just kind of look at how he, you know, just the tone of your voice and how much that can shift. And then you looked at the cancer cells, and, you know, you can take 2 similar forks, provided you know exactly what the frequency is, and you can actually just break that up right away.
Mm-hmm.
And
Like that quantum effect?
yeah, yeah. And then there's another one where you talked about the music, and I forgot his last name, Peter somebody in Sedona, and he'll take his harps up to the mountain, and the wind will actually just play the harps.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just like, okay, it's kind of, it's fascinating. And then you talk about the weather and how they're, you know, like with the volcanoes as well as the hurricanes, how they're disrupting all of that. So it's like, it's kind of scary, but you don't even need all of that. And you can use your intention, and you can, you know, shift that energy around. So,
Great synthesizing, wow.
yeah, well, there's a lot there. And,
Uh-huh.
you know, there's other places, you talked about the structures, the buildings. There's a college in St. Augustine, and God, who's the guy with the trains way back when? And they used to have their meetings in there, but it was more of a dome shape, and they could have somebody over here, but yet they could hear them way over here.
Mm-hmm.
And so they strategically placed people at the dining room tables so that the head honchos, I forgot who's the
So somebody
money.
was already using that in their
Years and years and years and
office
years ago.
design.
Yeah, years and years
Yeah.
ago. Yeah.
It's remarkable when you experience it, how and it almost is like sound can travel faster than light. It can be instantaneous.
Mhm.
How it could be present in one location and another. You know, we have that space in the Milwaukee Art Museum that's an echo chamber. It's a spiral shape, and it carries sound in a very unique way.
And the other thing that was very interesting, in Milwaukee turned it down, sad to say, but they were going to put an art structure, and it was a tuning fork.
Oh.
And it was out in front of the courthouse is where they were going to place it. And it would have healed so many people here in Milwaukee. But they turned it down. It's sad to say. That's all
Oh,
sad
that
to
is.
say. It'd be nice to know who the artist is and to get that back again.
Other thoughts? And I apologize, I don't know the time, and I'm looking at a clock, and it's the same time for the last hour.
It's 8:35.
Oh, okay, so that's pretty good.
Yeah.
So we're pretty close to time. Should we close it up then?